Coogs House, a top 25 team, is undefeated on the year. Their starting quarterback leaves them mid-season, over NIL pay in the same week that the NCAA is meeting to talk about the House settlement. Is this the future? Is this Houston's future? Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Cougs, daily podcast out by your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth. And whether you're a Houston fan or just a hater who came to stop by, thank you for making Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day. We appreciate you making Locked On Cougs your first listen each and every day. If you want to join the conversation, but don't know what to say, tell us in the comments down below if you've ever asked for a raise and how it went. Today's show is brought to you by our buddies over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. More on that later. But we got a lot to get into today. I want to talk about the future of college football and kind of big picture ideas after some news that came out on Wednesday. I want to talk some about how that news impacts Houston. But I guess first and foremost, we probably need to start off with talking through what happened at UNLV in the middle of the night, I guess Tuesday night into Wednesday morning. And frankly, wasn't a whole lot after we'd recorded the Wednesday morning episode of Locked On Cougs, but it was enough after that it didn't make the show. And so we're going to talk about the situation a little bit before getting into how this continues to roll out and hit Houston and others. This is a complicated situation. So pardon me for spending a whole segment talking about some other school, but UNLV had a gigantic, I don't know, distraction, problem, issue, whatever you want to call it, hit their front doorstep on Wednesday. Matthew Sluka, the transfer quarterback, that was my dog, has the Rebels at 3-0, 2-0 against Big 12 teams for its worth, and has a real shot, UNLV does, at getting to the college football playoff as the top ranked group of 5 team, right? The top ranked group of 5 teams guaranteed a spot in the 12-team playoff, and UNLV feels like a team that could really do that. They got to play Syracuse in a couple weeks, and then the conference looks like it's going to kind of come down to them and Boise. They win those 2 games, they really might be. They're already in the top 25 for the first time since becoming a Division I football program. Quarterback Matthew Sluka has decided to pull himself from that program. He decided to pull himself this early in the season because having played just 3 games, he can preserve his redshirt and have a full season of eligibility left. His comment included the quote, "I committed to UNLV on certain representations that were made to me, which were not upheld after I enrolled. Despite discussions, it became clear that these commitments would not be fulfilled in the future." So he stepped away from the program, and it does not look like he's coming back anytime soon. Now, he tweeted that at like midnight West Coast time over the course of the night going into Wednesday morning. And over the course of Wednesday, more news came out, right? A lot of Ross Dellinger, a lot of Pete Thamel reporting here. And admittedly, I'm combining a lot of the reports here to get through stuff. But reportedly, Sluka's agent says that Sluka, the quarterback, was told, and what their team would argue, their group would argue, a verbal agreement that he'd make $100,000. And Sluka's father reportedly has said that separately to different reports, they haven't received any of that money. The agent would later tag in and reiterate that we must allow negotiations, written agreements to happen and not put so many regulations on them. The school and coaches are negotiating, but you are allowing someone else to pay for it, hoping to get the money from the boosters. So the agent is admitting here that there may have been some talks to a coach, but the money's not coming from the coaches. The money's coming from elsewhere. And that because of all of the complications in trying to write something, so much of this is happening verbally. That seems to be problematic here. The agent says that coaches made the promise, the collective have made no payments. And it's interesting to say the least, because Those are two functioning different arms that I guess inherently don't have to talk to one another. But in modern college football, we all kind of assumed do. And with them not speaking together or not being on the same page, things can get a little wonky. The agent also said that coaches made the promise, the collectives that made no payments. The school and the coaches are commenting that that's just not what happened. And they argue, and the schools argued very bluntly, that UNLV does not engage in such activity, nor does it respond to implied threats. The agreement would have functionally been pay for play, which presently illegal. Now, I will point out that presently legal in terms of NCAA football rules. The House settlement is being worked on as we speak, and those conversations may yield a world where that's not illegal and possible against the rules. And so I want to say that that's legal for the NCAA presently. In the very near future, it might not be. Now, Sluka has a year left and is getting out at a point with his red shirt that he can keep that. And he was not the only UNLV player to go through this. Backup running back Michael Allen has done the same. He didn't allude to any NIL deals or anything like that. I believe I saw, I couldn't tell if it was his Twitter account or not, but a tweet from an account that looked like his, saying that it's not actually tied to NIL at all. It's more about on-field stuff, promises about playing time and things like that being unable to be fulfilled. And we've seen, I guess, that world a little bit more in the past, where kids show up thinking they're going to play a lot and then they don't because the other kids are better, or the coaching staff's got too many running backs, or whatever, right? Those are much more common conversations, but that's two of the leading four rushers for UNLV in a rush-heavy offense, as we saw up close and in person, and are backing out of the program just 3 weeks into what is already a historic season for the school. I don't think I need to stress to you that UNLV is up the creek without a paddle, and I'm not telling you what the creek is filled with, right? They've got problems with this, and frankly, if nothing else, they've got PR problems, right? Because what it looks like to anyone that was prospectively looking at, hey, it'd be fun to live in Las Vegas and play college football and do a bunch of things, is you've got one player saying he got promised cash he never getting, right? And even if that is a far cry from the truth, has a smell of truth, a whiff of truth, that PR issue is damaging to what Odom is building as a coach, what his staff is doing. Frankly, a staff that has kind of leaped and jumped, and like Brendan Marion's one of the hot offensive coordinator options out there for schools trying to pluck guys to Group of Five. I mean, the staff is well regarded, and this, you could argue, could lead to being kind of a pretty big blemish on those guys' resume. Who on the staff promised money? How many guys promised money? Were they in cahoots and promised this money? Who knew about is any of this real? Right? All of those conversations have to happen, right? And so suddenly we're in a world where all of college football is talking about a quarterback that 8 months ago was at UNLV. 8 months ago was at Holy Cross, not even at UNLV. And I think what's interesting in looking at this too is that Sluka didn't transfer officially till the start of the summer. They went on and got other quarterbacks, including Hajj Malik Williams from Campbell. We talked about the multiple quarterback options they had going into that game for Houston, right? And they had Hajj Malik play the entire spring before ultimately playing at Sluka from Holy Cross. It sounds like there may have been some agreement with Sluka to like finish his degree and then come after the fact. That's still kind of sketchy. But I say that because some of these agreements were being made in what was like, it sounds like the handshake verbal agreement kind of stuff may have been in an early transfer window, even though Sluka finished out the spring semester at Holy Cross. That part, admittedly, though, is murky and is one that I'm still trying to wade my way through the waters on. Regardless, the UNLV situation is messy, is sticky, is problematic on a bunch of different fronts, and frankly, is validating a lot of people with opinions on college football today. And it's also really gut punching for a bunch of people that really love the sport of college football. And I cannot imagine being a UNLV Rebels fan, having to watch us go through the program that you've grown to love, right? A historic season for that program. And I want to talk some about how this impacts programs like Houston and could directly impact Houston in a second. But first, we told you today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And we got all kinds of fun happening over with FanDuel. Fans can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. Whether you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can kind of check out the latest stats, you can view live play by play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets. You can start with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you put your first $5 bet down. That's FanDuel.com. Parker Ames with Locked On Cougs talking about how this UNLV mess can impact Houston and schools like that. I should say, and open with specifically for this season. Houston played a full strength UNLV team in the opening week with no real film on what they're going to do with Matthew Sluka, with no real understanding that roster, trying to put a Willie Fritz roster together for the first time. And obviously, all of that is to say that that game was difficult and it looked like it for Houston. Houston played very poorly at different parts as well. Not trying to excuse any of that, but Houston lost to a good UNLV team that at this point, again, is a top 25 team with a real shot at the college football playoff. It is very much realistic and very, very possible, some would argue even likely, that UNLV takes a gigantic step backwards with Matthew Sluka not being a starting quarterback. Malik Williams may take over and take off. Frankly, I was impressed with him in film getting ready for the game, not knowing who technically would be the starting quarterback, even though they acted like they knew, they weren't saying it. So maybe it doesn't. But if UNLV takes a big step backwards, the immediate impact on Houston is that strength of schedule takes a gigantic hit, right? Because that loss to UNLV in terms of machines and the analytic machines and so on is going to look worse and worse and worse, right? I think qualitatively, folks will understand what happened, but that's not how every single ranking comes out. And frankly, if we're being completely honest, there are all kinds of polls and things like that would indicate that not every voter knows everything or doesn't understand maybe the impact of a single player, even a quarterback on a team, right? And so I will say that UNLV taking a step back would hurt Houston. In a bigger picture, this could hit Houston in a couple ways in a much bigger sense, bigger than this season, and all of those are scary. The first thing is that these promises, however under or over the table they may be, clearly have to be kept. And with that, I should point out the NIL space at Houston is growing. We have a partnership with Roy, Return on You, that we're doing now, where we're giving away something to a different player every week. Shouts to Roy for that. There's all kinds of NIL collectives. I know Star Pizza does a bunch of work with guys and so on and so forth, right? And they're all small, right? HOUNIL, I think, was a thing at one point. I believe that's still functioning. Hoop and Holler, right? Or what? Those are all things that are going. But it is nowhere near the size of the Miamis, the Missouris, the Arkansas. And with so many people kind of like starting to get on board, that's great, but they have to find ways to uphold those promises without being as big as the Miamis, the Missouris, the Arkansas, etc. Right? And so if you're going to make promises, you've got to keep them. This is a blueprint for what to do if those are not being kept. And I don't think this will be the first week we see this happen in college football until things are dramatically shifted and changed. Now, Houston also, as a great athletic program, has kind of a similar spot to UNLV in that they frequently, as a Big 12 program, which is not what UNLV is, but they will pull guys up a division, right? An FCS All-American quarterback type of guy is not out of the realm of what Houston would be looking for. Now, they've got the quarterback recruits pretty well set up in 2025, 26. But if you told me they went on and got some all everything wide receiver out of the FCS level to come to Houston and the transfer portal, that would make a lot of sense to me. Or some big time tackle that put on weight at the FCS level and is ready to play Big 12 football, that would make sense to me. All of that FCS recruiting through the transfer portal is kind of the wild, wild west. And as we're seeing here, right, um, agreeing to terms, landing those recruits, those are all vital and important and need to have a lot of different people on the same page. That's the coaching staff, that's the NIL collectives, that's all of the different people have to be on the same page with these guys. And frankly, that may very well be what went wrong in this one. It sounds like the coaching staff knew he would be the starter. They didn't necessarily work with the collective directly or closely enough. I don't, but there's a miscue, right? And something didn't work. The other thing is that this 4-game redshirt deal has very literally bitten Houston in the past. Obviously, the De'Aaron King thing was no one's favorite moment in Cougar history, as much as I should say, liked watching him before all of that. Frankly, before the injury, I would point out that De'Aaron King could argue was one of the highest profile, first, earliest players to use this 4-game redshirt in this kind of fashion. I guess you could argue whether or not, whether or not NIL changed the landscape. He ultimately actually was at Miami after a COVID year, in which he actually got some NIL cash while there, but not the point. Adding NIL to that 4-game deal, Houston's got to find a way to be comparable to those bigger programs fast. Without, and I don't mean I judge this in any way, but it feels very apparent that Matthew Golden, Sam Brown, Hakeem Ejijolaya, Dot Nwankwo, the year before that, it was Cam Johnson, Alton McCaskill. Guys leave Houston for bigger NIL packages. If this becomes commonplace where guys are leaving 4 games into the season or withdrawing their name from the team 4 games into the season to leave at the end of this, at the next window or whatever, that's not great because Houston is still looking to build that program. We've heard before it's got the lowest funding numbers in different athletic department aspects of any Power 4 school, right? Well, suddenly, if that also translates into the NIL space, which, spoiler alert, it does, Matthew Golden, Sam Brown, Hakeem Ejijolaya, Dot Nwankwo, Cam Johnson, Alton McCaskill, those guys might be leading more like 4 games into the season with that red shirt, right? If this is a blueprint, I worry about how often that could hurt a place like Houston if we can't get the act together fast enough. Now, I think Houston kind of can, actually. I'm not all doom and gloom about this, but this will change college football forever. It just flat will. And I want to talk about some a little bit in the third segment because Houston's a college football program we'd like to see do pretty well in that future that's getting potentially altered. But first, I want to talk about making picks because picks are fun. And Prize Picks is America's #1 daily fantasy sports app with over 5 million active members. Prize Picks is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. All you have to do is pick more or less in 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll all in. If you want to play Prize Picks along Drewski, Joe Budden, MMA champ Sugar, Sean O'Malley, I'm not an MMA guy, but apparently he's a big deal. You can now find community plays under promos tab on the Prize Picks app to view entries from some of the biggest names in the Prize Picks community each and every week. Prize Picks is a ton of fun. You're going to make different picks on different stat lines. It's as simple as going more or less than different numbers, what you think will happen. Download the Prize Picks app today and use code Locked On College and get $50 instantly when you play $5. That's code Locked On College on Prize Picks to get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive the $50 bonus. It's just guaranteed. Prize Picks, run your game. Parker Angel Locked on Coogs on with the latest in the UNLV saga, what's going on, how that could impact Houston. And in this third and final segment, I'd like to talk about how this could potentially impact all of college football and perhaps college sports, because the other big deal here is that defensive tackle Bear Alexander appears to be doing the same. Bear Alexander, you remember talking about some of the transfer portal a couple years ago at this point. He is originally from Terrell. He went to high school at IMG. He was at Georgia, and as a freshman, played in 12 games for Georgia, was an impactful, big guy, 6'3", 315-pound defensive tackle. Transferred, I guess, entered the portal in spring of 23, I believe, right off the top of my head, to go to USC. Has been at USC since and is now using the same thing, preserving his red shirt and entering the transfer portal at the end of the season, it appears. And this is opening up the wild west aspect of this in many ways. And it feels like a high profile player. I mean, Barry Alexander in spring of 23 was one of the highest profile transfer defensive linemen, potentially like the next big thing, no pun intended, on the national champion Georgia defensive line. Georgia lost like one game in 3 years, right? And he was going to be a big part of the next step of their defense. He gets out of Georgia and he goes to USC with Lincoln Riley. And now, 4 games into his second year there, he's like, I'm out of this one. And there's no repercussions in terms of any rules or anything like that. Now, obviously, social repercussions, coaches could say, I don't want that kind of guy, yada, yada. But realistically, he's good enough that it would take a pretty strong his morals coach to say, I don't know that I want that guy. And that's without even knowing any of the circumstances around him leaving USC. This wild west, as I keep alluding to, in many ways feels kind of like a repentance or a pendulum swing, swing all the way over to the other end, or just this natural explosion of decades of college athletes and football specifically funding this economy that grows exponentially and relies on what was legally more or less unpaid labor. It's not sustainable, and it probably isn't forever, but the wild west thing that we end up in now is a natural spot to be in coming out of all of that, right? It's this overcorrection the other direction. And we're seeing it play out a number of ways. It wasn't quite as well reported on, I didn't feel like, but Jaden Rashad, I kind of had all this happening to him out of high school. A guy that people thought was going to go to Miami, then was going to go to Florida, and then backed out right before signing day because NIL money that was going to be like multiple commas in it didn't come through. Ended up at Arizona State, now is at Georgia. All of that happened to a kid that's like not even 21 years old yet. All of that mix up was in the same kind of vein. People not communicating, not being on the same page, players and their families thinking they're getting one thing, schools saying another thing, NIL collectives operating in a whole different dimension on it. There are just so many balls to be juggling in this. And then ultimately, the players have a limited amount of eligibility. And I promise, even with guys like Cam Rising and Alan Bowman out there that are like 25 years old playing quarterback, there really is a limited amount of time you can play college football in your life. That makes it like you got to kind of maximize your earnings in this world. And because there's no rules and regulations, you're kind of on your own in doing that. And what's funny to me is when you talk to players, and I talked to players when guys left Houston for what appeared to be, not saying anything in particular, but what appeared to be large NIL packages elsewhere. Players typically like, you know what? They got to do what they got to do, man. Most of the time, players like, hey, they got to go do what's best for them in their career. I got to do what's best for me in my career. love him as a teammate, yada yada. Right? There's generally speaking not a whole lot of ill will. There was the whole thing when Cam Johnson left, but outside of that, Alt McCaskill, I think, surprised a lot of people. I think fans were a lot more upset than players were. Um, Now, I say that this is all happening with this 4-game redshirt rule kind of serving as a weird part of it. The 4-game redshirt rule, I think, hits Houston fans pretty hard because of Derek King. And I think it's interesting that every time this happens, that case kind of gets not talked about as much because it was right before the NIL stuff hit college football. But it does feel like Derek King was this happening before all of that, right? Coaching change, he decides to play his 4 games. Like, I don't actually want to do this. But all y'all can see those 4 games, right? See that I'm healthy off my injury from last year. Okay, now let's talk. Now let's go to Miami, etc. Right? Um, Now, with that said, the irony of this happening, well, Charlie Baker, president of the NCAA, is talking with people about the House settlement and talking to reporters who were there covering the House settlement, where the House versus NCAA settlement, the one where schools may have to pay in the 20s of millions of dollars to athletes or whatever, right? Charlie Baker said that the big point behind the settlement is to actually put in place a structure that will be transparent, where people have obligations and assignments and responsibilities and accountability. I've said for almost a year now, the primary relationship in this should be between schools and student athletes. Now, I don't anticipate happening at Houston. I think the staff is very much on the same page in recruiting. If you look at the class 2025, early returns in class 2026, the staff is doing a great job recruiting. You got to give it time to all play out. They've got some talented young guys in the system currently that just need to grow and develop. They've got some talented young guys in 2025 and 26. They need to show up, grow, and develop. Right? I don't know that it's necessarily happening. That would feel like a dysfunction that I don't know that I sense right now from the staff. But it does feel like communication between the school and the athlete without those meaningful words like obligations, assignments, responsibilities, and accountability were exactly what didn't happen enough in the situation with Matthew Sluka, right? The communication was between the school and the athlete, and that wasn't quite enough or didn't include all the potential players here. And that might be what went wrong. That same, as Charlie Baker said, school and student athlete communicating. And so I don't know where this is in 2025, 6, 7. I don't think it's here. And I don't think that I'm being a crazy person by saying this is going to continue to evolve and develop and be different. I don't think programs are going to, schools are going to sit here and watch people use their programs as a 4-game tryouts for bigger and better NIL deals. But I also don't know, without serious legislation and changes, how they change it. It's in the rules right now, right? And so I watch this UNLV thing unfold. I watch what's happening with Matthew Sluka unfold. And honestly, I was already kind of paying attention to UNLV because of what happened with Houston and UNLV at the start of the season. And I sit there, on the one hand, happy players, if what Sluka says happened, are standing up for themselves. And on the other, as a fan of Houston, and as someone who wants to see them do well, really, really worried. And I don't know which of those two parts of me is more justified, but I know that they both exist. And I think it's okay that they both exist. And I don't think you got to feel like you have to pick one or the other to exist in yourself either. And I think that people are really trying to be on one side of this fence. And I don't think it's got a fence. I think it's a lot more fluid. It's more like a river. You can kind of go back and forth, side to side, as we all keep moving forward. If you want to tell me I'm wrong, feel free in the comments down below. Find me on X, Painswith512. Happy to talk about this kind of thing all day long. Locked On Coogs, primary Locked On podcast. Now it's your team every day. Go Coogs.